So I thought, in conclusion of this particular series of satsang, I would provide the core teaching in summary, which actually unfolds how one thing leads into the other, into the other, into the other, and why, at the very beginning of what I'll say, it's like, why is all of this relevant? Because if you're looking to make money, for example, following these steps is irrelevant. What's spoken about here is not a set of pointers to make money. If you are looking for perfect romantic relationship, or looking to develop your capacities in terms of romantic relationship, let's say, the pointers are not relevant. They're not designed for that. However, if what you are seeking, if what has happened is a seeking has happened, and you are seeking for enlightenment, if you want to use that word, but in practical terms, if you are seeking for what is available to the human being as happiness in this life, which is defined in this teaching as continuous unbroken peace of mind. So if it has become clear to you that actually that is an amazingly precious gift, if it sets in, to live the rest of your life at peace with life, and as that movement is happening, at least at peace with the parts of yourself that aren't at peace. So once we register, actually I have sought out this and that, and from time to time I have got this and that, and that's all part of the changing flow of life, and it doesn't deliver a continuous, sustained, ongoing happiness. And what I am really looking for is something that is consistent. And the suggestion that's put forward in the teaching is what is available, what has been spoken about as enlightenment, is a transformation of the human being such that they continue to live life having to do whatever is destined to participate in the flow of life, going to work, raising a family, being with friends, meeting strangers on the street. Continue doing that, continue living as the human being, but with a groundedness, a centeredness that allows peace of mind to remain as one's foundation in daily living, regardless of what it is that happens, which is largely outside of our control. So if that is what is being sought, a consistent way of living where suffering is not a component, a consistent way of living where if suffering arises, then there is a peace with that suffering. But ultimately, where no suffering arises, that is what the movement, if it starts, will eventually translate into, because it's the same principle that starts on the outside that delivers the peace with whatever bits are in struggle with life. It's that same principle that eventually penetrates through the whole system. So there's no reason why it can't be complete peace of mind. If there is peace of mind establishing on the outside, that just means the principle has penetrated so far. If it has penetrated so far, why can't it pervade more of the system? It makes complete sense that it can. So if that is the exploration, peace of mind in daily living, we need to become familiar. Firstly, what is peace of mind? Because if we don't understand what we are seeking, then the seeking process is not going to be focused. What is peace of mind? In simple terms, peace of mind is the absence, the non-arising of the psychological suffering, which is always an attitude to the flow of life, a reaction or an involvement, an attitudinal involvement with what is happening. And that attitudinal involvement tends to extend itself in horizontal time. It tends to look back at the past, forward into the future, and is a commentary about what should and shouldn't be, what I need in order to be complete. So the suffering is always an attitude to what is happening in the flow of life. And in practical terms, that attitude to the flow of life that we are calling suffering, the attitude to the flow of life which at its core is an uncomfortableness with oneself, manifests in broadly 5 different forms, all of which are attitudes to what has or is or might happen in the flow of life. The first is the attitude of guilt and shame. The second is the attitude of blame and hatred. The third is the attitude of pride and arrogance. The fourth is worry and anxiety. The fifth is expectation and attachment to outcomes. So those are the 5 different forms which this attitude to the flow of life takes, that are essentially an uncomfortableness with oneself, and each of those forms has a unique dynamic, a unique makeup to it. So remember, peace of mind is the absence of suffering. So it makes sense that we should investigate what this suffering is. The teaching says peace of mind is available because suffering is an attitude towards life that stems from a misconception about what life is. So, in essence, the attitude is based on an error. And if the error is corrected, and that's what can happen with errors, if the error is corrected, then the suffering that stems from that error will reduce and or completely stop. If the suffering wasn't based on an error, then you can't change something that is truth. You can't adjust something that is not inaccurate. So the great news is that our suffering is based on a misconception about oneself and life. That misconception arises as our attitude towards what is happening, including what is happening through the body-mind organism, as well as what is happening through all the other body-mind organisms. And if it gets corrected, that attitude no longer arises. So let's look at the 5 forms of suffering, which are what disturbs our peace of mind. The presence of suffering means the absence of peace of mind. So if we're looking for a state of being in life that is continuous, unbroken peace of mind, that means a state where these forms of suffering that disturb the peace of mind don't arise. We've mentioned that these forms of suffering are always a result of our attitude towards life and not because of the circumstance. So first let's look at the circumstance, because the attitude is an attitude towards the circumstance. Circumstance, which we can call the flow of life, is essentially interhuman relationship. Interhuman relationship, or the flow of life, well, let's put it into human relationship aside. The flow of life, which includes in a large part into human relationship, but it also includes your interaction with nature and with inanimate objects, as well as people. The flow of life is essentially circumstance, and circumstance, if it is in line with your biological preferences, which is part of your makeup that you didn't put in place. If circumstance is in line with your biological makeup, then pleasure will be experienced, and therefore we can say circumstance in that moment is pleasurable. And if circumstance is not in line with your biological preferences, then the circumstance will be experienced as painful. In broad terms, we can say that there is physical pleasure and pain, emotional pleasure and pain, financial pleasure and pain. If the sun is too hot, that is physical pain. If the weather is too cold, that is physical pain. If the sun feels great on your face and on your body and it's warming it up, then that is physical pleasure. If you eat a nice strawberry and you like the taste of strawberries, that's physical pleasure. If you have a nice warm shower, that's physical pleasure. If you are sleeping on a comfortable bed, then that's physical pleasure. And very clearly, physical pain is if you're sitting on an uncomfortable chair, if you're standing up and you're very tired, if you're squashed in a small space and it's claustrophobic. All of those are physical pain. Then you have emotional pleasure and pain, which is not suffering. It is a form of pleasure and pain in the flow of life. If someone tells you, you did a really good job, that is much more preferable than if someone tells you you did a rubbish job. Thanks so much for your help. I don't think I could have moved house without your help. You are a great friend. And there is emotional pleasure in that. We are glad that we were able to help. We are glad that this friendship exists in such a way that I feel happy to help. Now, the opposite is if the person says, I needed you, you sort of pretended that you were there for me to help, but actually you didn't really help. And I think that that wasn't very appropriate as part of this friendship. The opposite is, thank you so much, I don't think I could have done the job without you. Now, your preference has to be to receive the pleasure and not the painful response. So, in the case where you get told that you didn't help, that can be emotional pain. In the same way, if someone that you love, a parent, a friend, dies, that's a painful situation, and it's not physically painful to you. It hasn't affected your physical body, but it makes sense that something in the circumstance has happened, and there has to be a response. A sadness, we spent so much of our life together. I'm so grateful for the time we spent together, and I'm sad that they're not here anymore. So that can be, so that is sadness, and it is a form of emotional pain. Anger, if someone pushes you and pushes you into danger, you might push back and have a feeling of anger. Be careful what you're doing, that's dangerous. That is a form of emotional pain. You see someone that you haven't seen for a long time. Wow, so fantastic to see you. And that is excitement or emotional pleasure. What I'm describing at the moment is the flow of life and the simple biological pleasure or pain. At this stage, the suffering hasn't been referred to. So sadness towards a friend dying is not suffering at this point. It is just the biological sadness that a friend has died. It is the biological sadness, which is emotional, a biological emotional sadness, that your friend is upset with you. It is a biological, emotional sadness of anger because you are being pushed. The third is the financial pleasure and pain. You come out and you find that your car has been dented and it's going to cost $1,000 to get it fixed. Financial pain in the moment. You buy a lottery ticket and you win the first prize of $3,000. Financial pleasure in the moment. You are on the internet and you're looking at a plane ticket and it's $350 and you think, great, I'll book that. Tomorrow I just need to confirm something. Then tomorrow you go onto the computer and the price has gone to $450 from $350. That's financial pain in the moment. Not what you would prefer, but what has happened. If the price goes from $350 down to $250, that's financial pleasure in the moment. And it is pleasurable or painful, like the other forms of pleasures and pains, all on different levels of the system, but still within the scope of the pleasure and pain in the flow of life. So essentially it's very important for us to come to understand that in principle the flow of life is always going to be delivering pleasure and pain to us. Sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain. If there is noise outside and you're trying to listen to some music or trying to sleep or trying to listen to what I'm saying, the noise is part of your circumstantial pain. If there is a beautiful environment around, that's part of the circumstantial pleasure. If someone smiles at you on the street, that is pleasurable. If someone frowns at you, that is pain. If you're sitting next to someone on the aeroplane that you'd prefer not to be sitting next to because they haven't had a shower or they are taking up more space than maybe they should because their feet are into your space, that is pain in the moment. So life is always going to be pleasure or pain. Sometimes extreme pleasure and sometimes extreme pain, or anything in between. If we can register this, if we can actually take note, then we don't expect life to be something different than that. In our head, what we are, because we haven't realized that life is impersonal as it unfolds, we have a different view. We have this expectation that life will be pleasure, 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 which is completely unrealistic compared to the actual nature of the flow of life. So to the extent that we understand that in each moment there will be pleasure or pain, if we find ourselves on the way to the airport and we realize that we've miscalculated the taxi and we're running late, that is pain in the moment. And it's expected in a way. Like if you understand the nature of the flow of life, then you won't be surprised that life is delivering pain sometimes. You get to the airport after being worried in the taxi for an hour and you get there just in time and then you realize the plane has been delayed by 5 hours. Pain in the moment. Not what you would prefer. You might get to the airport, with 15 minutes before the scheduled departure time and you're almost sure I've missed the flight, an international flight that was very expensive and I've missed it. And then you get in and you see it's been delayed by 3 hours. That's pleasure in the moment. Because if it hadn't been delayed, you would have missed the flight. The fact it was delayed is actually very well suited to the situation you found yourself of being stuck in the taxi and getting to the airport at a time that would have missed your flight, delayed by 3 hours, perfect. So that is the description of the flow of life. Our attitude to the flow of life, which is the attitude on which the 5 forms of suffering arise, is a very specific attitude. So we should ask, what is my attitude to the flow of life that leads to suffering? And what is the attitude to the flow of life that leads to peace of mind? And the answer is very simple. The attitude to the flow of life that leads to suffering is the attitude of personal doership, which sees oneself as the doer of everything that you think, feel, say, and act or do. And therefore you see the other in the same way as a separate, independent entity that is in complete control of everything that it says, feels, thinks, and does. That is one half of the attitude that leads, the attitude to the flow of life that leads to suffering, and the other half of the attitude to the flow of life that leads to suffering is the attitude that says my completeness, my happiness, my centeredness is completely dependent on outcomes. And therefore we are seeking for life to be pleasure, 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 because we believe that it is the outcomes in the flow of life that will deliver a sense of fulfillment. We believe it is outcomes in the flow of life that will remove this sense of uncomfortableness that we have found that is part of our life experience. And if that is the attitude to the flow of life, those 2 components, then really we can say that that is a deeply ingrained belief system in the person that we can call the false psychological self. It is that psychological self that effectively interacts with the flow of life. Now, that psychological self, I am the doer, the other is the doer, and my happiness is to be found in outcomes, has a very tough time with the flow of life that is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. Because what it is saying is, I am defined by outcomes. What I am is linked to outcomes. That's what the belief that says my happiness is to be found in outcomes is saying, is I am identified with outcomes. I am dependent on outcomes. So you can see how that psychological identity is bound to freak out when it is put in daily life. Now, it doesn't freak out because daily life is delivering pain sometimes, because even if life delivered pleasure, 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 what we would find is the suffering would still be there, because that psychological identity will be worrying about when the pleasure in life is going to stop. And the psychological identity by default is not who we are, so there has to be an intrinsic uncomfortableness with it. For as long as we are disconnected from ourselves, there will be an uncomfortableness in life. Because our happiness isn't to be found in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. So even if we got pleasure, 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 there will still be this uncomfortableness of that psychological self. Now, because all of this is deeply ingrained, when we feel the uncomfortableness, we don't know where it's coming from. So that's why the body-mind system has said, I feel uncomfortable because circumstance isn't the way it is, or the way I would like it to be. And so it has set out with a mission to make circumstance better. It has set out with a mission to control circumstance. And that only reinforces the identity that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, which means even more uncomfortableness pervading the life experience. And we still don't know where that's coming from. We feel more uncomfortableness, and then we say, it's because my partner did this, my friend did this, the stranger on the street did that, I did this and it was not up to scratch. And that is the attitude to life, that is the attitude that maintains the false sense of self. The notion that my completeness will one day be found when life is perfect, and the attitude that says, you weren't perfect, I wasn't perfect, you should have done this, you didn't do that, I didn't do this, I should have done that, which is the doership. And what is the attitude to the flow of life that leads to peace of mind? It's the dissolving of the attitude to the flow of life that leads to suffering. So the attitude that leads to suffering is the attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcome. The attitude that leads to peace of mind we could call an attitude of non-doership, an attitude of non-attachment. But that attitude of non-doership and non-attachment is not the positive belief system that, oh, I am not the doer, my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. It is the dissolving of the opposite attitude that says, I am the doer, and the dissolving of the belief that says, my happiness is to be found in the flow of life. So really the peace of mind is based on the attitude of non-doership and non-attachment, which is the dissolving of that attitude. So this is leading us through this step by step. If we are seeking peace of mind in daily living, it makes sense that we have to understand what peace of mind is, the end of suffering. It makes sense that we have to understand what suffering is. It's an attitude to the flow of life. It makes sense that we have to understand what the flow of life is in nature, sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. Then it makes sense that we have to understand what the basis of the attitude to the flow of life is that leads to the 5 forms of suffering. And it's been described here as the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. It's been described that the peace of mind is the dissolving of that attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. And so now let's look at how those 2 attitudes translate into and manifest as the different forms of suffering. Guilt and shame, blame and hatred, pride and arrogance. So really it's guilt, blame and pride. Guilt manifests as the feeling of shame. Blame manifests as the feeling of hatred. Pride manifests as the feeling of arrogance. But what is guilt, blame based on? Guilt is the attitude to a circumstance whereby this body-mind organism, me, has functioned a particular way, and the outcome delivers pain to myself or someone I love, which is then pain for me. And when I function in such a way that delivers pain, if the attachment to outcome is in place, which is the belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, I see that pain and I say, that is an attack on myself. That outcome is an attack on myself because it is delivering pain to me. It is delivering an outcome that is not favorable to me. So for example, there is anger and I shout at someone and upset them. And then I don't feel good. I feel pain that I've upset someone. So at that stage, it's all biological. Pleasure or pain in the moment. And in this case, pain in the moment. The attitude of doership and attachment to outcome sees that pain and it says, where did that pain come from? The pain came from my actions. So that pain was me attacking my own happiness, is what this psychological identity, how it relates to it. And then it says, I am the doer of that pain. I could have functioned much more civilly. I shouldn't have got angry. And it feels guilt for getting angry. Guilt essentially means I'm not good enough. I didn't perform well enough. I am a failure. So as soon as it concludes, I am guilty, that is the attitude of guilt, and it manifests as a feeling of shame. A sense that I am not a worthy human being because anger happened through me. That's the guilt. Blame is based on the same principle of personal doership and seeing pain as an attack on who I am. But instead of it being an attitude towards actions that happen through me, it's an attitude of attachment to outcome and doership for actions that happen through the other. The other shouted at me, which is pain being delivered from the other. I receive that pain not just as pain in the moment, but as an attack on who I believe myself to be. This psychological identity receives the pain and says, how dare you deliver pain to me? That is the opposite of what I need in order to be complete. And it is you as a separate independent doer that is delivering that pain to me. You could act differently. I hate you for you delivering the pain to me, which is an attack on who I am. I hate you because you could have and should have done it differently. So that blame based on the belief in personal doership and the assessment that pain is an attack on who I am at my core. Really, it is an assessment by the psychological entity that is just a belief system, has no idea what the human being really is at its core, and so creates all this nonsense. It's quite funny from one angle, a bit tragic from another angle. Pride and arrogance is in a way a lighter form of suffering than shame, less dense, but still nonetheless coming from this psychological identity. That means a not knowing who we are, and therefore it is uncomfortableness with oneself. It is a form of suffering. And it is applying the same principle of personal doership and attachment to outcomes. And it is looking at those actions that happen through me that deliver a positive outcome. And then it says, look at what I have done as the doer. Me, the doer, look how good I am that I am producing these results. I am delivering pleasure to myself. And I expect the others to deliver pleasure to me when they realize what good results I am delivering. And so that is the identity of pride that feels defined by the pleasure that is happening through the body and is taking ownership over that pleasure through the false interpretation that the action that happens through this body is in the control of this fictitious psychological entity that comes in after the action and claims ownership as if it created it. And that psychological identity in itself is not the body-mind organism that is performing the actions which turn out to be pleasurable or painful. It is a fictitious psychological identity that has no idea about how life works and is imagining life works a certain way, in which it is attributing responsibility to this psychological identity that doesn't produce anything except for uncomfortableness and suffering through its attitude to the flow of life, which is a happening according to God's will. So the pride based on the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, just like the blame and the guilt. So you can see that half of human suffering, the guilt, blame and pride, based on this notion that I am the doer and my happiness is to be found in the flow of life. Now, worry and anxiety is based on the notion that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, and we are worried and anxious about what the outcome in the future will be because of what it means to who I am. Pretty simple. In its extreme form, it is anxiety. In its less extreme form, it's worry. And expectation and attachment to outcome, also a way of reacting to how the circumstance unfolds. That is the feeling that if we missed our flight, which is really just pain in the moment, the feeling that, no, this can't have happened. But not because it can't have happened because I can't afford another $800, which might be the case. It's not just that, but it penetrates down, and we can feel when we say, no, this can't have happened. It starts off because of the financial pain, but then it turns into this sense that it is an attack on who I am. And so attachment to outcome is the feeling that arises, that is a feeling of attack on who I am when circumstance turns out painfully. Expectation is something a little different, but can turn into attachment to outcome, the feeling of attachment to outcome, if the expectation isn't met. So the suffering of expectation can be the simple thinking about something you would like to happen in the future that isn't happening now. And that thinking can, and usually is, obsessive. We're continually imagining some sort of success, some sort of outcome, like meeting our soulmate or our business venture becoming very widely accepted, some sort of creation that we make that will allow us to feel worthy and valuable and content. So we have this expectation, and the expectation is about outcomes, and it's an expectation that that outcome will deliver contentment. We can have expectations about spiritual practice, expectations about peak experiences, expectations about enlightenment. And expectation can take two forms. You can have an expectation that is misguided, like the expectation that enlightenment is about oneness experiences, for example. So that is an expectation that is off the mark, and it will cause its own problems because it is off the mark. And for as long as we are thinking about that and waiting for it to happen, that thinking, which is what we can call the thinking of expectation, is disturbing our resting in the present moment. Because resting in the present moment is essentially saying, actually, I exist, I'm okay. I don't need that to be complete. So while we're thinking about, I'm really looking forward to going out on this holiday because I suspect that I'm going to meet lots of people and that's where I'll find my soulmate. And so we're really excited about something because we have this expectation that my happiness will be delivered at that time. And then if it isn't, the expectation turns into the feeling of attachment to outcome, the feeling of disappointment. Because inevitably, what we expected will deliver some continuous happiness doesn't, because it's pleasure and it can't. So you can see how expectation is this continually disturbing of the present moment, even when the expectation hasn't crystallized yet. So you can be expecting something for years and years and years, which actually delivers a sense that I'm not complete yet, and I will be one day. And its expectation is a subtle suffering to some extent. At first, we don't think it's suffering because we think, I'm looking forward to something good. It's only when we realize how disturbing that thinking and looking forward to something good is compared to just resting in being. We realize it is the obstacle that prevents us from resting in being. And that's when we start having a reason to say, stop thinking about how things are going to turn out in the future. Even if that thinking is hopeful and positive, stop and just be. It doesn't mean you don't plan for something in the future, but you make your plans, which are just the practical things you need to do. Once that's done, let it go and wait and see what turns out. So in business, if you need to do some forward thinking, by all means, that's not the thinking of expectation and the thinking of the thinking mind. That's the working mind. And it says, in order to meet this objective, I need to do this, this, and this. And the working mind says that objective is actually going to be pleasure if it happens, not my happiness. And the working mind says pleasure is not a bad thing. I would rather pleasure than pain, so let me try and put things in place. And then once you've done what you need to do, no need to keep thinking about it. So this brings me into the description of the working mind versus the thinking mind. Thinking in life is necessary. You can't function without thought. It is the thinking of the thinking mind, which I've been referring to throughout this talk. The thinking of the thinking mind are the different forms of suffering. They are the attitude to the flow of life: guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. And in its intense, concentrated form, the thinking mind doesn't present itself as thoughts, but presents itself as bodily sensation or feeling, a feeling of uncomfortableness. Essentially, that feeling of uncomfortableness has the narrative of the thinking mind in it, but in a very concentrated form. And you will only see the narrative if you connect to that emotion and put words onto it. And then when you put the words onto it, you'll realize that the feeling of despair might be, I'm not good enough to live in this life, and I'm never going to succeed. And that's when an uncomfortable feeling of despair can present itself as actually a concentrated version of the narrative of guilt. The working mind, on the other hand, can function as thinking. It is functional thinking. It is the part of the intellect that will work out when you need to order a taxi in order to get to the airport on time, how much money you need to take on holiday with you. It works out what food to get at the grocery store. It's part of your sensibility of being able to look after yourself, wash, know how to use a knife and fork. All of that is part of the functioning of the human being. And when that functional aspect of the human being includes functional thinking, we call that the working mind. So this talk is talking to the working mind. It is delivering conceptual descriptions about the topic of happiness in daily living. And it's describing all of the components so that the working mind at some point will contemplate these concepts and start to understand them more and more deeply, and start to investigate whether the concepts are correct or not based on an investigation of one's own life experience. So when you get to the airport next time and you see that you have arrived exactly 3 hours before your flight, and the thought arises, this is pleasure in the moment. So you can put a tick next to the concept. I have tested it out for myself that circumstance in this moment is either pleasure or pain. It's pleasure in the moment because I have arrived 3 hours before my flight. It hasn't been delayed, and that is in line with my biological preferences. Yes, circumstances, pleasure in the moment. Someone pushes in front of you in the line, and the attitude of blame arises, and the working mind might kick in, and there will be a awareness of the uncomfortableness of blame, and the working mind might say, this is suffering in the moment based on my attitude to the person that has pushed in front of me, my attitude that if he pushes in front of me, that's an attack on who I am, and my attitude that sees him as the doer rather than seeing this as part of the unfolding of a much broader life experience. So seeing him as the doer, rather seeing him as an instrument through which my destined pain in the moment is being delivered. So as this happens, as the working mind starts to see life more and more frequently along the lines that are being described, which is a natural occurrence. You don't have to do this. You are being conditioned now. You don't have to do anything to be conditioned. Just sitting in the environment is the new conditioning being delivered, the up-to-date conditioning changing, and then you find yourself functioning according to your up-to-date conditioning, meaning the thought arises, him pushing in front of me is pain in the moment. This uncomfortableness is blame, my attitude to the circumstance. That's not something that you do. It's something that arises because the situation has inspired it relative to your current makeup. If you hadn't sat in satsang, the new conditioning that is being delivered here wouldn't be what was delivered to you. It wouldn't become part of your up-to-date conditioning. You would find yourself in the line at the airport. The person would push in front of you. The anger would arise. The blame on top of the anger would be there. And the thought, this is pain in the moment. The uncomfortableness is my suffering. Not caused by him, but caused by my own internal makeup that relates to the pain of him pushing in front and turns it into blame. So it is my creation, or the body-mind organism's creation. Often we project the blame outwards and say, you caused the blame. They were the instrument through which pain was delivered in the flow of life. The blame was an internal reaction that may or may not have happened depending on your internal makeup. That doesn't mean that we should blame ourselves for that suffering, because the understanding realizes I was conditioned by life to be this way, based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning. So I was designed by life to be this way. And I can't help but blame the person if the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome is there. So all of this thinking is not suffering. That thinking is the functioning of the working mind. It is functional thinking that in it doesn't include suffering. The blame itself that might arise is of the thinking mind. That is the suffering. But the recognition of the various components is the working mind. And the working mind is not part of the suffering. The working mind can be there and it doesn't disturb our peace of mind. So this notion between the working mind thoughts and the thinking mind thoughts is really important. Otherwise we might think that the mission is to have no thoughts. Now, no thinking when you are doing certain explorations in order to become aware of awareness, no thinking in those explorations is very valid, because even the thinking of the working mind can get in the way of a revelation of this formless awareness that is the background to everything. But if we are just living in daily life and not doing a particular exploration, then the working mind is part and parcel of us actually being functional human beings. If we prayed to God, please God, take all my thinking away. My thinking is my suffering. I don't want to think. Take it away. Then once again, let's hope God doesn't oblige, because if He did, we would find ourselves in a really precarious situation, because we wouldn't know how to wash ourselves, we wouldn't know how to eat, we wouldn't be able to talk to the other, we wouldn't be able to calculate anything. We basically wouldn't be able to function in life. So once again, the Chinese proverb, be careful what you wish for, because you might just get it. So this means we have to be clear on what components are the problems and what components aren't. And that way our awareness starts to become aware of the fine details.
So you said the working mind doesn't have any suffering. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
Yes. It doesn't produce suffering. It doesn't. The working mind is not part of the attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcomes. It is functional. It doesn't. The working mind, the pure working mind, doesn't know how to insist on life being a particular way. It doesn't believe that its happiness is to be found in the outcomes. The working mind knows that outcome would be more pleasurable to me than that outcome. So I will work towards that outcome, but I won't be attached to it actually happening. Meaning I won't feel defined by whether it happens or not. The thinking mind says that outcome is more pleasurable than that outcome, so I am going to make that outcome happen using my control in life, and I'm going to make it happen and engage in it as if that pleasure is a matter of life and death to who I am. That if the pleasure doesn't eventuate, that is an attack on who I am. So you can see when the thinking mind is working and driving us, we're a disaster zone. Our relationship to circumstance and to what we can actually, how we can function is completely misguided. The working mind, on the other hand, doesn't have that misguidance in it. However, when the two exist in the system, because the working mind is part of your biological intelligence, so everyone has the working mind. The problem is nearly everyone has the thinking mind. So the thinking mind infiltrates and infects everything that the working mind is working towards. Artists, painters, dancers, someone who enjoys gardening, from time to time has the experience when they are fully involved in an activity where the thinking mind actually subsides and there is just the working mind happening, just the biological movement of the body. And that's why people become so they crave that state, because it is a state where they are in flow with life. where life is efficient and where creativity happens. So we can start to see that when the thinking mind falls away, we're not going to become, chaotic members of society that is irresponsible. When the thinking mind falls away, our biological intelligence gets to function uninfected by the thinking mind.
So it seems as if the working mind is very unemotional, rational, and the thinking mind is emotional.
No, I wouldn't say that, because the working mind, which is part of the biological makeup of the body, includes emotion. So the biological intelligence of the body includes emotion. That's why there is emotional pain in the moment, even when the thinking mind has subsided. Right? So if we think that the working mind is just dry and flat and logical, we're essentially not appreciating the complexity of the biological aspect of the human being. So when the thinking mind and the psychological identity has fallen away, we actually feel that love is available, that compassion is available, that sensitivity is available, that appreciation of art and of life is available, that gratitude is available, that awe is available. And all of those aspects are not at all, just mechanical, linear functions. So we have to appreciate the working mind doesn't make the mistake of attachment and doership, but it is a very complex functioning instrument. And so when I'm talking about the working mind, we can link it to the working mind as a part of the biological functioning of the body. Now often when someone hears biological functioning, they might think about the bladder or the liver filtering out impurities from our system. Okay, that's biological. The heart pumping, fingernails growing. The biological also includes our thinking of the working mind. It includes our emotions. They are part of the biological functioning. So essentially we separate the functioning of the human being into biological reactions and psychological reactions. The psychological reactions are the reactions based on the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. The biological reactions are part of the functioning of the flow of life, part of the circumstance of the flow of life. And it includes emotions. So that separating of the psychological reactions and the biological reactions is very important. They are both happenings according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning. Both the psychological and the biological are not in anyone's control. They are happenings. And it's useful to get this conceptual distinction. Within the biological reactions, there is a subset that we are referring to as the working mind, which is a functional thinking. And it's also, you could say, there is the contemplating mind. But to me, the contemplating mind, which is contemplating my own existence, contemplating the concepts that are put forwards in spiritual practices, that to me is a subset of the working mind. But we might think the working mind is just about planning. And so then introducing this notion of the contemplating mind allows us to know, when I am thinking about spiritual seeking, that too is a working mind function that we're dividing off into the contemplating mind.
Is there a simple distinction between the working mind and the thinking mind? Like if there was one pointer you could think about.
The thinking mind is always your attitude to circumstance that feels uncomfortable. That's something we really have to become familiar with, is that the thinking mind, the psychological identity, whenever it is functioning, is uncomfortableness. And it's always based on this attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. So once that becomes really clear that that is what the thinking mind is, then everything else that is not that, that doesn't feel uncomfortable, that isn't guilt, blame, pride, worry, expectation, everything that isn't that is essentially the working mind, and you know that when that's happening, it's not disturbing your peace of mind. The working mind might be disappointed about something. It might say, the working mind might say, you know, looking back in hindsight, that investment decision really wasn't a good one. And it says so, and as a result, my life has now really needed to be reconfigured. That is just an objective assessment, and it can include a disappointment, but it doesn't include in it regret and blame and shame. So we can see the biological functioning of the body, including the working mind, can feel the pain of a situation, but it doesn't turn it into this uncomfortable bitterness that the thinking mind does.
So the working mind is essentially being, right? In some ways.
Being is...
Because there's no suffering in it inherently.
Yes, so what you would say, you can say, is the working mind is not in opposition to peace of mind.
But it's not being.
No, being is, as I use the word, is a word to describe where we rest when we drop out of the thinking mind and connect to the core of ourself that is already complete. And then in that beingness, usually there isn't, in that beingness there is a sort of a sweetness, a softness. And it doesn't, it is prior to any thinking. So the working mind might be happening, but when you drop into being, what's center stage essentially, although ironically it doesn't feel like it's in the front, it feels like it's in the back, but what is the main sensation, or not sensation so much, but aspect is this, this resting. And so beingness is not really a something, whereas thinking is something. Beingness is reserved, that word rest in your being is reserved for a dropping into your core and stopping essentially. And once that's established, we can rest in being and still function.
So you can function without the working mind while you're just resting in the being in day-to-day life?
Well, if you rest in being, it might be that you're resting in being while doing nothing in particular, while looking at the sunset, for example, or sitting at a cafe and rest in being, and there isn't much that you have to function in. As that becomes more and more an available space that you are grounded into, you can actually have a conversation with someone while you are resting in being. Right? It doesn't pull you out of being. So you are talking is happening, and at the same time there is a centeredness. So if you're in an argument with someone, or you're not really in an argument, but if someone is a bit flustered and you are resting in being, what will happen is you'll be able to engage with them and say, listen, I understand you're upset, but let's look at it from a different perspective. It might help. And you remain centered in being, and yet you can function. As that centered in beingness develops, you can find yourself walking through the supermarket, picking what you need, maybe even reading some of the things, and remaining centered in being.
So you don't actually need the working mind at all in
No, but
sense.
when you are going through the supermarket, and you look at maybe an ingredient to see whether it has certain type of fat in it that you are trying to avoid, or whether the sugar content is too high because you have diabetes, then you are grounded in your being, but you are registering, the sugar content is 30%, and no, that's not appropriate for my diabetes. So that is the working mind. So the fact that when things are just happening naturally, or we might think the working mind isn't there, but it is there in a form. You're not randomly just picking anything. There is a seeing, this is the coffee section, and your hand goes for the coffee. So that means that the coffee is seen, it's registered as coffee. That's all part of the working mind. And you can see that doesn't create suffering. So the working mind that picks up the coffee and then it says, actually this one's on special, half price, and I remember having that brand, I'll take that one. That's the working mind. No suffering in that. Imagine you see this one half price and you go, damn it, why isn't the one that I want half price? I'm sure the staff here, they don't know what people like. They put that would then be the thinking mind.
So we have been speaking today of the types of suffering, and when we look at them really close, it seems that the mechanism how they get delivered, they can be differentiated. But in the end, all of the sufferings or pleasures, they're a sensation felt in the body, right? And so why I'm saying this, because sometimes...
Sorry, wait.
Yeah.
All of the pleasures and pains are felt in the body. The suffering is our attitude, which is a psychological aspect, right? Still, you could say it's part of the body-mind organism. But the suffering really is on the level of thinking. And in its intense form, it's felt in the body, suffering.
Okay, so let's keep the intense forms then. So that's why I'm actually pointing or sharing this, that when it's intense, then sometimes it's difficult to contemplate, or the intellect is just gone for a toss. And so I find it very helpful to see in those moments that there is just a sensation which is very strong, and then I can relax into that much more than when I'm trying to analyze it or see it.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. Actually, I mean, there are contemplating requires space, and so suffering is really the opposite of space and the opposite of contemplating. So if the suffering is intense, you can't contemplate, and if you have I should be contemplating, it just becomes more suffering. It intensifies the suffering. So if we understand that when the suffering is destined to be of a certain thing, if we're lucky, we can just surrender. If we're lucky, because that surrender already means there's a lot of understanding, right? And it can be that when the suffering is really intense, there's absolutely no understanding, which means no potential to even surrender to the suffering. Which is why the seeking has to happen not when suffering arises, but we have to become earnest seekers, which means I just want to know this as part of understanding who I am, understanding life better. Not, I want to know this only when suffering is arising so that I feel better. And if we find the seeking happening when the suffering isn't happening, then when the suffering is happening, there is potential for that space, for there to be more space than if the seeking didn't happen before. Because even what you're saying is essentially, it's an insight, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it comes because there was an inquiry and a watching, an observation of life before the suffering, and it comes because when the suffering is really intense, you would have seen yourself trying to contemplate and how it doesn't happen. So all of that is because of your, so each time that is seen, each time you see, I try to contemplate and it doesn't happen, that's new conditioning, essentially. And so your recognition of that becomes part of your up-to-date conditioning, and then at some point when the suffering is intense, your movement is towards surrendering into it, or what was the word you used?
Accepting that there is heavy sensations and
feeling the sensation.
Feelings, yeah. So just dropping the thinking at all, just wait for it to pass and...
Yes. So that's why, in spiritual teachings, there are so many little things here and there to deal with all of these things. So this too shall pass is one of the wisdoms that is saying, you can't do something about it, but it will pass. So you can relax. Whereas if we don't know this too shall pass, when it's there, it feels like it needs to be dealt with. And if we think that it will only go away if we make it go away, then there is this involvement. And so this too shall pass is wisdom that says, you can't control these things, but they will change. The nature of life has changed. So when we get that, there's more non-doership that comes into the system. So what you are describing to me is the attitude of non-doership kicking in.
Yeah, thanks.
I'm not sure where I got to in the unraveling of the conceptual framework. So if I haven't finished, it's probably worth finishing, because as I see it, this information is so important. Like if we don't have the information, we can't see the pleasure and pain as being the nature of life. We don't realize that it's our attitude to the pleasure of pain that is the problem, because everything is mashed up like a big mess of cotton thread with knots and everything, and and you don't know. And as the descriptions come in, over time we start seeing, oh yeah, that's that, and that's that, and that's that. We start becoming familiar with our internal landscape, and it starts organizing it in a way, or at least we become much more of an expert towards our internal system, and we can see what previously was a big mess. We can see it. So I think that I was speaking about the 5 forms of suffering, and had got on to worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes as being forms of suffering based on the belief my happiness is to be found in outcomes, and that is an uncomfortableness that covers up the peace of mind that is available if that sort of thinking isn't clouding the system. And that expectation is about waiting for something to happen in the future, or wanting something to happen in the future with the idea that it will deliver something that it can never deliver, but we believe it can deliver, which is part of the error. So in the expectation we see there is the error that my happiness is to be found in the flow of life. So we've now spoken about the different forms of suffering. And we've seen the attitude on which they arise. We now need to look at that attitude and see if it is really an error or whether it's not an error. Because if we don't have the capacity to see it as an error, then the system will keep functioning as it always has, which is on the basis that this attitude is accurate. So why is the belief in personal doership an error? And why is attachment to outcome an error? And it's quite a simple explanation. I'll try and be direct with it. In brief, the belief in personal doership sees us as an entity that is insulated from life. It doesn't appreciate how we have come into existence. It doesn't appreciate that the body-mind organism is essentially a piece of hardware that then has a operating system and software uploaded into it. The body is a result of the very complex genetic blueprint that gets put in place when the sperm and the egg join. That's when the blueprint is in place, and the body then grows, impersonally grows. I didn't ever do any of the growing. I didn't have to, take time out of the day and control the growing. So the body grows according to the blueprint. And if there's something in the blueprint that says my thumb isn't going to grow, then I would be born without a thumb. And in the blueprint, it includes the color of my eyes, it includes how the brain is structured, it includes everything about the body-mind organism. And that genetic blueprint is continually growing through our whole life, growing and dying through the whole life, changing. But it changes according to its design. So at a certain point, cataracts, let's say, comes in to someone's eyes because of their blueprint. Now, it's not only because of the blueprint, because the blueprint never grows in isolation. It always grows in an environment, and the environment is one with the blueprint, one with the organism that is growing. So in each moment, the organism is a result of the genetic blueprint that is growing and the environment that affects the genetic blueprint. So what we divide up into genes and up-to-date conditioning is really one thing. But there are two influencing factors, broadly two: the genetic design and how the genetic design is impacted by the circumstance. So if the mother has an infection in her embryonic fluid, that is part of the environment in which the blueprint is growing, and that infection becomes one with the blueprint, however it happens to be. So it might mean that the baby's born blind, for example. The genetic blueprint originally wouldn't have resulted in blindness, but because of the circumstance, the blindness comes there. And it's no one's fault. It is just a result of the blueprint and the circumstance. And so when we're born, we find ourselves in every moment in life, not insulated from life, born to a certain set of parents, born in a certain religious or environment where a certain religion is predominant, where a certain political system is predominant. Our parents send us to a particular school, and our parents deliver new conditioning to us. The religious leaders deliver new conditioning to us moment after moment. Our school is delivering new conditioning to us moment after moment. Our friends delivering new conditioning to us moment after moment. And the new conditioning becomes part of our up-to-date conditioning, which is one with the genetic blueprint. So in each moment we are one way because of this immensely complex set of factors that in general fall under two categories: the genes and up-to-date conditioning. Now, when you look at it, we weren't in control of the genetic blueprint. We are a result of that. And we weren't in control of which family we were born to, which part of the world we were born to, which school we were sent to, which friends we made, which people were in the school, what teachers were in the school. And all of that stuff that we weren't in control of is what determines who we are in each moment. So whether we have a mind that is good at maths and not so good at English, or not so good at language, that is no one's doing, but it's there. We can't deny it. Someone can do great maths and not very good at creative stuff. And that's the fact. And so if we don't take it personally, we would say, look, I can tell you I am very good at maths and I'm not very good at art. There's nothing to be ashamed of. It's a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning that I wasn't in control of. I am a result. I am not the creator, but I am what has been created. And I function according to how I have been created. And how I am created is continually changing, because life is continually delivering new conditioning. So, at the moment, I am not great at art. Doesn't mean that tomorrow I won't be better at art, because today someone might give me some tips that might become part of my up-to-date conditioning, and I find that actually my genetic structure supports the new tips, and I can draw something that I never thought I could draw before. Or someone is, very kind and says, look, let me tell you all about it, tells me all about it, and then when I try to do it, I still produce really bad art. Because the combination will only be able to turn into one thing. And their goodwill about trying to make me a bit better artist, my motivation to be a better artist, may not result in me being a better artist. So after I try, I say, actually this is rubbish. This is not good. It's not personal. It's like, this is not good. I'm not a good artist. And let's say you're not good at maths and you're not good at art. You say, I'm not good at maths and I'm not good at art. Say, I'm good at building things. And if you're not good at building things, you're not good at maths, you're not good at art, you say, actually, I'm not good at anything. Not, yes. But it's not personal. It's like, I've been created by life this way. What I am good at is recognizing that I'm not good at anything and it's not personal. And that person might say, and that I am really, really grateful for. If, however, they see, I'm not good at this, I'm not good at this, I'm not good at this, and life has created the misunderstanding that is so typical in the way that we develop in life, then that person is going to feel like I am a complete failure, and that feeling of being a failure, which is a misinterpretation of how life works, a misinterpretation of who is responsible for that individual not being good at art, not being good at maths. No. That is a huge load of uncomfortableness, a huge load on suffering, on top of the poor skills in various areas. Whereas if someone has poor skills in this area and they have no suffering, they'll tell you, I have no problem. I feel light. And someone else would say, how can you shouldn't feel light because you haven't done anything in your life. What have you produced? And then that person, if they start believing the other, right? Oh, maybe I should be a certain way and I'm not. Then the suffering could come in. Right? And then their peace with themselves, their peace with life will get disturbed. Now that is because of the new conditioning in that moment from the other that says, you shouldn't be fine. You haven't done anything in your life. You've wasted your life. You should be ashamed of yourself. If that new conditioning becomes part of the up-to-date conditioning, the person might start to feel ashamed. If they're really lucky, they'll say, that's your view. What I can tell you is, I feel great. And I haven't produced anything. The person might say, I feel great, and because I feel great, I go into the world and I deliver an openness. I don't deliver resentment. I don't deliver blame. I don't deliver all of these egoic things. And I think that's a great contribution. So now not only do I feel great, but then we start to see, oh, I am lucky because I've been given this attitude that isn't making me feel like I need to be one thing or another. And that wasn't my doing, and I'm very grateful for that. And now I see that actually I'm not as much of an untalented human as I might have thought, because what I deliver into life is the absence of all of the hate and blame and shame and craving. And the truth is that very few of us have nothing to be pleased about in terms of what we have. It's just that our focus tends to be on the things we don't have. So often, if someone is not a good artist, they may well focus on that and feel bad about that instead of recognizing that they are good at something else. And that's because the deeply ingrained belief is, I need pleasure, 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 so the fact I'm good at that, well, I'm good at it, so I don't need to worry about that. I just need to look at all the stuff I'm not good at. So often we're trying to become a perfect human being instead of seeing the perfection. Anyway, I divert, because really what I was talking about is, why is the belief in personal doership an error? And what I was describing, it's an error because the way we find ourselves in this moment is a result of two factors which we never had any control of: our genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so anything that comes out of my mouth is a result of who I am now, not my doing, definitely what is happening, but a result of factors beyond my control. And then I can see the other is exactly the same, a biological instrument that has been grown by life, that has grown up in a certain environment. The conditioning that was delivered moment after moment has become part of who they are. And they can't function differently. They can't be better or worse. They are as they are. That is the simple understanding that I'm not the doer. From a more holistic point of view, we can see that all of life is a happening, much bigger than just you and I, and we are part of it, and that all of life is happening exactly as it's happening, and that we can see all of life is a happening and no one's doing. And if we come to see life as a spontaneous arising in the moment, as a experience arising in consciousness, then from that perspective also we'll see life just is. I don't know where it came from. I don't know where this moment came from. Even the notion that it came from the Big Bang is not really verifiable in this moment. In this moment, I don't even know that I was born 46 years ago. All I know is this moment. And so from the perspective of life being seen as a spontaneous arising, we see that even the speaking, the actions of the body, the outcomes, good or bad, are part of that spontaneous arising in consciousness that is unfolding moment after moment after moment. So from very many different perspectives, the notion of I am not the doer can be affirmed. When we look at what the notion I am the doer is saying, it's saying I am insulated from life. I am independent and autonomous, and whatever I think, whatever I say, however I act, is because I, as this separate autonomous entity, choose to do this and not that. And that is a more effective way, in a way, to just be left with non-doership, because at some point you say, absolutely not. How can I possibly choose when, and we see that something happens in the circumstance, and our response, our reaction, how we biologically feel about it, is given to us. We find out about it after whatever has happened in the circumstance affects the body-mind organism. That's when we know how we feel about it, not before. We don't stop and say, how shall I feel about this? We feel about it as a result of the body-mind organism functioning. And if we see this, the other notion that says, I am a doer, I am a separate, insulated, meaning I've never been influenced by life. Whatever I decide is not a result of being influenced, not a result of being connected to life, but as a result of me being a separate, independent, autonomous entity that is in complete control. Now, at some point, that's how people live. That's the self-identity that life has generally puts in place. The evolution of life, once we are conceived and then born, is an evolution such that the ego at about age 2 or 3 sets in. That's when the idea of me and mine kicks in, and that's when the tantrums start happening. When you take the toy off the baby, it's, no, that's mine, give it back to me. Don't take what is mine. And that is where the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome has formed. And the baby, the child, then starts referring to them not as in the third person, which they did before, but rather, oh, I am Roger. Yeah, I am Roger, and I do this, and this is mine. So it gets put in place. When we really look at it objectively and see what it means, that idea is that I am in control of who I am. I am in control of whether I have good art skills or not. I am in control whether I have good math skills or not. I am in control whether I have a short temper or I'm very patient. It's a form of insanity. But it's an insanity that life has embedded into us. And through spiritual seeking, life is undoing the insanity, such that more peace and less suffering kicks in. The other attitude of attachment to outcome, how can we verify whether that is right or wrong, whether it is misguided or an error? And it's simple. We have a whole lifetime of experience whereby we have been seeking pleasure, thinking that it will deliver continuous happiness. Once I get this, I'm sure many of us, everyone has prayed, God, even if I don't believe there's a God, at some point they've said, God, just this one thing. This one thing, please give me this. It is so important to me. If you give me this, then I will be your servant forever. Why are we saying that? Because we really believe that that thing is going to give us something lasting and ongoing, is going to give us a sense of a removal of the uncomfortableness that we have in that moment. And that uncomfortableness in that moment is because of attachment to that thing. So we say, please God, if you give me this, my life will be fine, and then I'll dedicate myself to you. So we have our own experience that shows us that we have believed that our happiness is to be found in outcomes. We have been seeking outcomes, and most of us have got at least some of the outcomes that we've been seeking. And then what happens is we get them and we think, oh, that's nice, but it's not quite what I thought. In the next day, we find ourselves setting a new objective, a new goal, still feeling uncomfortable. Maybe it takes a week after we get what we were really craving. And then a week later, we find that the effect of having got what we want wears off because it doesn't deliver continuous, unbroken happiness. And we are now craving for the next thing. Oh, please God, I was wrong about that, but this next thing, give me that. The same attitude to the outcome we haven't learned from the previous time. Once again, the Chinese proverb, be careful what you wish for, you might just get it. Some things you pray for, you get, you realize that they're not what you thought they were, and then you can't get rid of them. So, be clear on what you're really looking for. In this teaching, it says, we're looking for continuous unbroken peace of mind. And we've just spent an hour and a bit talking about what exactly that is and where it comes from, what the error in the system is. So, our attachment to outcome, we all have our experience in the past that should at some point be enough for us to say, maybe I've got it wrong. Maybe there is a deeply ingrained belief that is completely mistaken, and like most of society, we haven't realized, even though it's right there in front of us, appearing time after time after time, we haven't realized that our happiness is not to be found in the flow of life. We haven't realized that our happiness is not to be found in outcomes. We haven't realized that even love from the other is not going to give us this peace of mind. And so that's one proof for ourselves, if we really look at it and see the implication of it, that tells us my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. The other proof along that same line, which is really powerful, is when we start finding a connection to the core of who we are, and in the face of pain, in the face of even pleasure, we rest in our being and we realize, I don't mind if the pleasure stops, I still am. And in the face of pain, we have lost our job and the thinking mind kicks in, and then we realize this disturbance is an uncomfortableness with oneself, and an uncomfortableness with oneself is a forgetting who I am and a believing myself to be something I'm not, which is enforced and included in the narrative of the worry or the anxiety from having lost your job. And in that moment, we might remember and drop back into our being, and we realize, we connect. And it's like, here I am. Yeah, I'll deal with that. I will start applying for jobs. First thing I need to do is fix my resume up. But in that moment, you've dropped into your own being, and you remember. Not remember in your head. I remember. You get direct feedback from your sense of self that says, it's okay. I am, even with the news that I've lost my job. And then you say, yeah, I'll rest here for a bit. And then with the working mind, I will do what is needed to try and improve my circumstance, knowing that the outcome is not in my control, but knowing that this core is always here. So the more that we drop into being in the face of pain, and we find our suffering gets cut off, and we find that our happiness in the form of peace of mind is there even in the face of pain, then we get first-hand proof my completeness is not dependent on pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. Because I can feel complete and at peace even in the face of a loved one dying, in the face of having lost my job, in the face of someone having cheated me, in the face of someone keeping me up at night, till 3 a.m. because they're playing loud music. We get our own confirmation that that aspect of the human being is always available at our core. Now, when that movement into being hasn't established itself, we don't have any other experience other than, well, the best I can do in life is get pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. This is why the spiritual teachings point us inwards and say, no, what you are at your core is not dependent on outcomes. Rest there, become familiar with it. And as we do that, we start to appreciate, wow, you know, this ingrained belief was pointing me in completely the wrong direction. And then we see, wow, but all of society, all of humanity is pointing in that direction that I was pointed in. And that's when we realize, oh, we've lost a connection to ourselves. And so, therefore, we're forced to seek completion outward. And society doesn't tell us, no, don't seek outward, don't want more, because where you'll find peace is inward. Society doesn't tell us that. One, because society doesn't know. Two, because it's not in society's interest, especially economics. They don't tell you, just relax into your own being and then see what happens. They say, no, you need more. You need to buy more of what I have to sell. And if you do buy more of what I have to sell, you'll get closer to happiness. And spirituality is there in the background, saying, I mean, when I say spiritual, I mean spiritual teachings. In the end, we realize life is spirituality, that spirituality is not a segment of life, but rather spirituality is an attitude to all of life. It's an attitude to finance, it's an attitude to relationship, it's an attitude to pleasure, it's an attitude to holidays, it's an attitude to family. That's spirituality. But spiritual teachings are there telling us it's not out there. It's not out there. But we're not designed to resonate with that until we are. And when we do start resonating, and we read more and more, and we hear more and more, we say, why didn't my parents tell me this? Then we realize, because they didn't know. So that explanation, we are not the doers, because everything is happening according to God's will, because everything is a spontaneous arising in the moment, or because everything that happens through me is a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning, two factors I had absolutely no control of. That's why the belief in personal doership that says I should have acted differently, I'm in control of who I am, and I could act any way in a particular moment, I could fly if I want. It would be an extreme belief of the notion of personal doership. Basically, it's a ridiculous belief that we can be a whole range of things, when in fact the reality is we are one way in each moment. So as we see this more and more, when the suffering from that belief in personal doership arises, we'll say, okay, it's arising because the belief is there. But now another part of the system says, I don't believe it. And it may be that that part of the system in that moment is not strong enough to do anything about it. It's not destined for it to stop. But at least that part of the system is saying, it's there. It's telling me that I should have and I could have done it differently. It's blaming myself because the outcome is pain, and I believe in that part of me that pain is an attack on who I am. But actually, I don't believe that story. So as that part of us strengthens, the other part, the old part of the doership, starts to run out of juice. Same, attachment to outcomes. My happiness is to be found in outcomes. We might feel anxious about an outcome. We might feel expectation about something and catch that this narrative about how I want things to work out in the next 6 months, and if they work out that way, how great it will be because I can do this and that. We see that and we say, okay, it's happening. I've seen it and it hasn't stopped happening, but I don't believe that. And as this I don't believe it sets in, and not I don't believe it just because I've been told it's not true, but because I've really investigated and seen it's not true. As we investigate more, this part of us that knows it's not true gets stronger. There's less involvement in that other part, and so it loses its juice.
That means people who are always in worry. There are some people who are worrying about environment. Oh my God, what will happen? And also facing death, for example. And they are always attached to negative outcome. They think always there will be some negative outcome. Or why is it? How could you explain? Maybe you did this fourth one. Always worrying and be in envy. Is it envy?
Anxiety. Well, essentially, intuitively, and not only intuitively, we've seen that life can deliver anything. In any moment we can have a pain, then go to the doctor and get a result back that says things are not good. And so to the extent that someone has registered that this is how life can be, the attachment to outcome in that particular person can, if it's of a certain type that then finds itself worrying about the future all the time, turns into this uncomfortableness, like, what will happen if I get a critical illness? What will happen if the environment, suddenly all the bees die and then we don't have any food? And the anxiety and the worry is intense uncomfortableness. And the fact is, it's true, the bees might stop pollinating flowers if they die. And then we will have a problem. But let's deal with that, or I'll have to deal with it. I'll have to live in that situation if it happens. The fact is, it may not happen because there are people that are using the working mind to see that this is a problem, to inform people, to put legislation in place. And so it may not happen. And often what our anxiety says is, this is going to happen. I'm sure I have cancer. If we feel a pain, the anxiety will say, this is it, somehow I know I have cancer. And then they go and get tested, and the result comes back and it's nothing. Now, it's not that it always will be nothing, but what we have to realize is that that feeling of anxiety is convinced that the worst is going to happen and there's no option. And when we start seeing that my anxiety is a feeling that floods the system, it tells me that the worst has already happened and I'm just waiting to find out about it. And in reality, when the anxiety fades away, we look at life differently and we say, actually, what makes me think this is cancer? It could just be heartburn or because of something I ate. And then we say, that's strange, because last night I was convinced that I had 6 months to live. That's what the anxiety is saying. It's a complete attachment to outcome and ultimately an attachment to being the body and not being connected to the core that is content because it is now. That's the core of the human that is so potent. That's where we find our center, where we rest in that isness, and we find that that isness is just happy being now. It has no thought about whether it will be tomorrow, whether it was last year. And it knows, maybe I won't be tomorrow, but I'll deal with that tomorrow. So anxiety, it's not that you shouldn't feel anxiety, because if someone feels anxiety, they can't help it. They would love not to feel anxiety. It's a very uncomfortableness with oneself. And it's a result of these factors, and particularly the attitude of attachment to outcome. Meaning, if outcome is negative, who will I be? And the ultimate assault on this identity that believes it is just the body is death. That is the ultimate assault on that psychological identity, which is why spiritual teachings has said when this psychological identity dissolves, the fear of death dissolves with it. Which doesn't mean if someone approaches me with a gun or a knife that I won't be biologically afraid. But that's a biological fear in a circumstance. When I'm sitting at home watching television or lying in bed at night, what won't arise is a psychological fear of death. Actually, if I think about what is after death, now this might not be right, but based on an understanding of what life is, an experience, death is, in my account, the end of experience. And definitely the end of Roger. So Roger just says, well, actually that would be great, very peaceful. There won't even be Roger to feel it being peaceful. So for Roger, it is the complete end. And Roger says, how can I be worried about that? I'm not even there I won't be there to have a problem. So the worry is actually not a worry about death. It's a worry about the idea of death in life. That is what the fear of death is. The fear of the psychological identity in this moment about an imagination of not being. If we don't exist after death, then there won't be a problem, even for that psychological entity that is having a problem in life with the idea of death. Death will be peace from that suffering, peace from that fear, peace from that anxiety. But the fact is that life is an unfolding of this human experience, and anxiety is one of the forms of suffering, which will fall away because the fear of death, the psychological fear of death, falls away.
I'm not sure, but I was thinking the result of losing the sense of doership and attachment to outcomes would be a state similar to the one you have when you drop into being. So it's some similarity maybe. Because
yeah, when that attachment to outcome and belief in personal doership isn't there, our access to being is very much available. We can rest there most of the time. What I've found is that when the suffering doesn't arise, then there's less of a reason to rest in being. When the suffering is there, dropping into being is basically the breaking of the habit of suffering. We remember, oh, I am, and drop into beingness. And so from dropping out of suffering into beingness feels like the base, feels like home, feels like who I am. At least it feels like that is peace, because it's dropping out of suffering. What if that beingness isn't always available, continuous, unbroken beingness? Then we might think, oh, that's a shame, because that means I don't have continuous, unbroken peace of mind. But what if continuous, unbroken peace of mind is available, but it doesn't need there to be continuous, unbroken beingness? Now, because continuous, unbroken, or because beingness is so nice, so sweet, we say, well, okay, this is what I want. And it's easy because we know beingness as the opposite of suffering, because we drop into being. What if that's another expectation or another attachment to something that is not available on a continuous, unbroken basis. And then the mind says, oh, well, if that's not available on a continuous, unbroken basis, then my peace of mind isn't available on a continuous, unbroken basis. And I'm saying, what if peace of mind is available on a continuous, unbroken basis, but it's even more simple and more plain than the feeling of being? And so, what do you mean? So what about if you are walking down the street? You're not resting in the feeling of being. You're just walking down the street feeling like you are the person. And you spend the day, and there's no suffering arising. No need to drop into being because the suffering doesn't arise. If we set up the expectation that enlightenment, peace of mind is beingness, then we might say, oh, something is missing in this day. Whereas actually, except for the expectation that beingness is there all the time, nothing's missing. As soon as the expectation for beingness falls away, then there is full peace of mind with just feeling like the person, let's say not even any connection to being. And there's no problem. That is peace of mind in its very simple form. Then let's say at the end of the day, you sit down with a cup of tea and you realize, I haven't been feeling some being today, but I've been at peace. No problem. And then you say, and then you drop into being. Here it is. So it's like a pleasure. But it's a pleasure that is not dependent on circumstance, really. In a way, it might be dependent on circumstance because what you're doing, your activity, may not be compatible with dropping into being. But it's available anytime you stop. And it's available simultaneous to a lot of your movements, talking and walking. It is available then as well. But it may not be destined for it to be there when walking. And if it's not there when walking, as long as you don't have an expectation for it, and there is no other form of suffering, no guilt, no blame, no pride, no worry and anxiety, and no other expectation, including the expectation of beingness, then you find, I have peace of mind. And so then if someone says, but peace of mind is one thing, but you can have so much more. You could be resting in being. And then you say, actually, I'm just happy with peace of mind. And it turns out that being is the core of who I am, and I can rest there as often as I want. But if I find myself through a particular day not resting there for whatever reason, I don't want to, or it doesn't happen, or whatever, and there is peace of mind, I say, so what? If there was suffering and I wasn't resting in being, then it wouldn't exactly be so what, because the experience during the day would be of uncomfortableness. And that in itself, if I don't get involved in it, then there's a peace with the suffering. The suffering is suffering. You can't avoid the fact that if there is a feeling of suffering, it is suffering. The best is if we find ourselves at peace with that suffering, and even better still is if the suffering doesn't arise. So as long as there is the absence of suffering, which is peace of mind, I say that peace of mind is even more simple than being.
Yeah, I guess this is a misunderstanding many people, many seekers have, because we have the thought that all the great sages were always constantly in their being, like Ramana Maharshi or someone. You may think they were always functioning from that point, not just peace of mind, but always from their being. So that's I guess it's why we think that that's the thing to have.
And it makes sense because you see the pictures and you know your own feeling from being, and there's no denying it's a gift in itself. But if we set that up as what we're really looking for, we might have set up something more complex than what is really available. So the thing is, was there a time in the day, maybe an hour or 10 minutes, where Ramana isn't resting in being. Now, obviously, all the photos that you put up are times when he's resting in, really in like meditation. But when he's in the, and I know this is, because I know you can function from being while talking to someone, while chopping the carrots and whatever. You can. It's not that you can't do that. The question is that peace of mind? Right? Or is peace of mind something more simple? And so this teaching says what we're really looking for is peace of mind. When there is peace of mind, even the simple one, then there is no wanting things to be different. But it's so easy for the mind to go, yeah, okay, but what about I have peace of mind and being at the same time? I say, yeah, that's great, that's a bonus. But what if for 10 minutes or for an hour, there is just peace of mind and no being? Then someone will say, well, that's not as good. Something's missing. And I say, well, your experience, if you did just have peace of mind, no being, is that nothing is missing. Because that's what peace of mind is. Peace of mind is the absence of the feeling anything is missing.
I have another question. It's about death.
Okay.
You just talked about it. I agree with you. I also have this view that death is the end of Joseph and experience. But I'm not happy with it. I have the feeling that I'm not happy with it because it seems so nothingness.
But nothingness for who?
Yeah, it's true. But
so
it seems like boring to me. Like.
But boring for who?
Yeah, I can understand what you say intellectually, but
no. But so the important thing is to see that the uncomfortableness, the fact that it seems boring, like it's important to see that that is a modulation of mind in daily living, right? It is an interpretation of something that actually will be completely different because it will be the absence of that modulation of mind.
Yes.
So to recognize, I think I'm assessing it correctly, but this thinking that is assessing the absence of Joseph can't, because it is the presence of Joseph. Or at least even the presence of the thinking mind. So it can't get it right. And so if there is an uncomfortableness, it's because you can see the uncomfortableness is, that will be boring, that will be nothing. And then we say, for who? And you realize that, well, for no one. And then where's the problem? So that then says, be clear that it is a problem, like anxiety, created in the present moment, and it isn't really a problem about the past, so a problem about the future. It is a problem in the present moment, using an imagination of the future as the food, let's say.
Yeah, I was thinking also that it may be an attachment to having experience, which is
very
life.
much, yes.
And maybe this is,
Mm-hmm.
kind of like to to live and to have experiences, and that since I have the image, it's the end of having experiences. This is, I want to continue to have, and I'm having fun somehow.
Yeah. So that it is a fear of the end of experience, but the more familiar we are with experience, and we see that, when you're in deep sleep, there's no experience. Then waking happens, and you are having fun only when there is experience. The feeling of I enjoy life is here in deep sleep. There was no worry about the fact that, no sense that why am I not having experience. So in life, you say, I enjoy it. And the more familiar we are with life as experience, I'm not talking about the experience of being on a roller coaster at Disneyland. That's one part of experience. But all of life, just seeing the chair, is experience. all of life, from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to deep sleep, including dream state, is experience happening. So life is experience. At some point, like any movie, like any story, there has to be an end chapter, right? And death is essentially the end of life, the end of experience. And the more familiar we are with experience, the more we realize that it's fine when it's there. Actually, it can be a drag when it's there. If the body is aching, let's say, if you have to do hard work. So you say, okay, experience is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. At some point in life, you'll say, I might not have experienced all of the pleasures or all of the pain, but I've experienced enough pleasure to know what pleasure is. I've experienced enough pain to know what pain is. And do I need to experience all of the pleasures? In principle, you know what pleasure and pain is. Furthermore, at a certain time of having lived enough life, especially if the body starts to get tired, you say, actually, I've even had enough of pleasure and pain. The idea of the end of experience is like, what a relief. That's why it's called Mahasamadhi. So samadhi can be peace in daily living, where you are not involved in the pleasure and pain, where there is no attachment to the outcomes, no attitude of doership, and that is a form of samadhi. Death is Mahasamadhi, the ultimate peace. Peace even from the flow of pleasure and pain. And I believe, like even now, the notion of the end of experience for me, not very old, middle age, I can run with it. Like, okay, one day Roger doesn't even have to deal with the hassle. Some parts of life are a hassle, you have to walk up hills, you have to walk in the sun. They have their counterbalance as well. You get to, after you've walked in the sun, sit down and have an ice cream, let's say, or walk into an air-conditioned room, and that's play. At some point you say, well, okay, I know pleasure and I know pain, and the notion of no more Roger, no more experience is like, I can live with that. Now, I'm not at the point where I say, you can't live. No, you can't live, yeah. I'm not at the point where I'm wishing for that. But I know at some point, the last chapter of this story, the story of Rogerness, the last chapter has to be there. And in a way, I know the end of each chapter in going to sleep at night. And it's not at all a problem. And then the next chapter happens, and I'm back here. I go, okay, good, I'm glad to be here for this chapter. And then at night, I know the end of the chapter. Now, in death, my best guess, based on how everything has unfolded, is that there is no more Roger. Death is not much different to falling into deep sleep, as my estimation. Now, if Roger dies and then suddenly I wake up, not I wake up, there is some other entity that wakes up, and it's not going to be Roger. Roger was the dream character. So if some other entity wakes up and then is living life, well, that's not me, that's not Roger. So I don't know what is after death, but I'm running with the model, especially as you become clear on what experience is, that there is no Roger after death. After the death of this physical body of Roger, there is no more Roger experience. And I'm Roger, so whatever is after Roger's death, they can experience it. They can deal with it. And if there is nothing after Roger's death, then there's no one to have a problem with it, no one to deal with it. Your point is very valid. If certain identities are still in place, there is going to be an uncomfortableness with the notion of death. Because death means the end of the psychological identity, and the psychological identity is attached to pleasure, it is attached to experience, it is attached to being. So the notion that I've put forward of nothing is not going to sit well with whatever bits of the identity are still there. But as that gets cleaned out, the experience is no one to have a problem in death.